Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. Before we get to the interview, let me introduce our special guest. Dr. Eric Goddard is a historian and dedicated educator at Trine University, whose scholarly work sits at the intersection of medieval European history, institutional history, and the history of higher education. His rigorous academic research focused on the University of Paris during the late medieval period, contributing groundbreaking scholarship to how early universities operated within complex political and religious landscapes of the 14th and 15th centuries. His peer-reviewed article in History of Universities examining demographic representation in the 15th century crisis of the University of Paris demonstrates his interest for institutional history, while his earlier work challenging long-standing myths about Parisian scholars and papal provisions showcases his ability to re-examine historical assumptions with fresh and critical perspectives. So, thank you, Dr. Goddard, for being here.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, this is a special episode because you're not just a colleague, but I consider you a friend as well. So you're a nice guy. I'm glad that you're here and that you're willing to do this interview with me.
Yeah,
So I appreciate
totally.
you doing that. Thank you. So one question I'd like to start things off with is, so I know you're a history teacher, but for today's topic, you wanted to discuss teaching methods in AI. And I was just curious, what made you passionate or interested in teaching, like in talking about different techniques and incorporating AI into your teaching methods? What made you want to talk about this particular topic today?
Well, I think it's really something that's kind of an existential question for teachers today.
Oh, yeah.
Trying to react to some of the changes that are taking place and just the access that students have to information and the environment in which we're asking students to build skills. And I think it's just something that's really critical to think about critically. And I do definitely see possibilities for using AI in teaching. I am also somebody who sees the challenges of having AI kind of short circuit some of the skills and the activities that we might have students engage in order to build skills as well. So I think it's partly a question of passion and what I'm interested in. For me, it's also kind of an existential question as a teacher. I really feel like it's something we have to, I wouldn't say just get right, because I don't know if there's necessarily a single answer to the question, but I think it's definitely something that we have to engage with critically.
Yeah, I think that's definitely the big frontier that professors or just teachers in general are dealing with, because they're like, a lot of our teaching in our assessment comes from like papers or having students do presentations or things like that. And AI can do so much work for them. When AI can do all the thinking and writing and work for you, what are students really getting out of it? So I just want to get your thoughts on how you think education is going to be with AI now.
Well, I think one of the things that's, I think, really shifted with the AI, some kind of revolution that's taking place is just the extraordinary importance of the time that you have in the classroom with the degree, because you can try to ask students to do work outside of class, or you can try to set up guardrails. But as we know, the techniques for detecting or proving if students aren't doing things according to the guidelines are far from perfect. And for me as an instructor, one of the things that I find is there's so many things that I want to do with students. I guess I see the role as a teacher not so much as just kind of transmitting information, which is really not a short supply at all. Anybody can get an infinite supply of information at any particular moment in time. But I'm really trying to sort of curate learning experiences so that people have a genuine engagement with material and are able to take away insight from information in a way that connects with their own experience and goals. And for me, increasingly, I find that a lot of the work that I want to do with students, I need to have occur in the classroom. So I try to be really strategic about taking some of the things that I used to do in the classroom and maybe have students do some of those things on their own in order to open up more time for interaction and engagement in the classroom.
Yeah, yeah. I noticed that you mentioned to me before that you use role playing in the classroom. Can you walk us through how that typically works and what it's designed to accomplish academically, and how you incorporate that into your lessons and everything?
Sure. Yeah. So role playing, obviously, it's a technique that's used by a lot of different instructors. A lot of the classes in which I use role playing are specifically history classes,
Mhm.
although its usefulness is certainly not limited to history classes. But generally speaking, when you're doing a role playing game, the type that I use in history classes, you're asking students to basically come to a particular moment, a particular historical circumstance, a particular moment in time. And this would be like a historical moment in time. So, for example, I have students play a role playing game about a revolt that occurred in a monastery in France in
Oh
the
wow.
500 CE.
Oh wow.
And so, in preparation for that game, they learn a little bit about the historical circumstances of this revolt that took place in the monastery. And then there's a point in time when the game starts,
Mm-hmm.
and the students are assigned different roles in that historical circumstance.
Mm.
And once the game starts, they're free to make decisions and pursue objectives as their character in the game.
Mm.
And they're not bound by what actually took place in history. So
Right.
they're free to make decisions that might differ from the actual historical outcome. But the historical circumstances of the game are designed so that they're actually learning about the historical circumstances, even though the outcome of the game might be a little bit different from what actually took place in history.
It sounds like something they really enjoy because they get to not only are they learning about how people were back then, but they're also embodying this character in which they have a lot of flexibility and freedom to kind of participate, make the game fun.
Yeah, one of the things that I do at the end of the semester is I have students reflect back over the semester and to talk about the different learning activities that they found to be most interesting or rewarding or beneficial. And not all students connect with role playing.
Right.
Some of them find the performative aspect a little bit intimidating,
Yeah.
the speaking in front of other people.
Mm.
But I would say the vast majority tend to identify some of those role playing games as among the most meaningful activities for the semester.
I remember you also mentioned like podcasts can be another strategic lesson activity that you do in the class.
Yeah,
How
so I
do you-
should say up until the present, what I've typically done is identify particular podcasts that that explore issues that we're talking about in the classroom in kind of a deeper way. And
Oh, I see.
then I'll ask students to listen to the podcast.
Mm.
And then we'll have a discussion in class. So, for example,
Oh, very
my government class, we talk about basic civil rights and civil liberties. And one podcast that I assigned to them kind of focuses on the case of an African American man who suffered racial discrimination in the selection of his jury in a trial that he underwent.
okay.
And so the podcast just basically explores the problem of racial discrimination in jury selection and different methods that have been used to try to address that issue.
Mm-hmm.
And it kind of highlights some of the challenges that exist in preserving our current jury system as it operates while trying to avoid the problem of racial discrimination. And so I'll have students watch that podcast and I'll give them some questions in advance to make sure that they're understanding what's going on in the podcast. But then, in a class, we tend to focus on what society should do as a result of this particular problem. So focusing on the issue of policy, not just kind of going over all the facts of the podcast,
Right.
but really talking about the pros and cons of the policy options that are laid out in the podcast.
And I think that's a very useful thing to engage students simply because podcasting is really big right now. All of our students are listening to some version of a podcast. And I think that's a really good way to keep students engaged with the material because oftentimes they may not like the lecture in class, where they're just
Right, right.
listening and absorbing information. But podcasting, it almost feels like they're listening to people share their thoughts and opinions. They actually get to formulate their ideas. I'm up to discuss the issues a bit more. Do you have any issues with like students not speaking up and trying to get them engaged in the material? Any thoughts or advice you could go about providing information about that?
Yeah, in terms of, getting students engaged in the classroom, I guess there's a couple things that I find to be super important. First, for better or for worse, I do think that some students are great motivated. And so I think it is important, I think, to set up the incentives in your class so that participation in class is rewarded in terms of grades. So, like in most of the classes that I teach, typically participation is at least 20% of a student's grade because I really want to motivate that. But in addition, I also think that's important to give students different ways of participating in class. I think there are going to be some students who are always going to feel comfortable speaking up in a class of 20 or 30. There are some other students who are always going to feel kind of intimidated by that. And I do think there's something to be said for motivating students to come out of their comfort zone a little bit and maybe to speak up when it's not something that they are naturally comfortable doing. But I also think it's valuable to have other ways that students can participate in class. But typically, I'll give students participation credit for speaking openly in front of groups. I'll also give participation credit for people interacting in smaller groups. But there's definitely a lot of students in class who will who will be engaged if they're working in smaller groups and will take active part, but maybe more hesitant to speak up in front of the group as a whole. The other thing that I find is I do reward verbal participation, but I also oftentimes have students do some sort of written activity in class to base their participation on. That's partly for me from a record keeping perspective, because it's easier for me to evaluate written material than it is to evaluate verbal participation that's coming in from all sides at once. But I also find that it helps students who are perhaps a little bit more introverted and need a little bit more time to formulate their thoughts and to write out their thoughts before they're able to share it. And it also helps me just to diagnose a little bit more about what's going on in the classroom. And by having the written elements, the group elements, the class elements, and kind of combining those together as part of an overall participation grade, I feel like I'm able to motivate a pretty wide swath of students to be engaged in class.
Sounds like it. I used to give some points for participation, but participation points in my classes weren't a lot, you know. It was just kind of to get students to stay engaged and connect with their classmates and speak up here and there. But I kind of think with AI on the rise, more weight might be placed on participation points because with like papers, students can have AI write papers. So I'm thinking, how can I actually assess students by testing to see what they have in here, what they have in their head. And a lot of that may seem like it's more or less just participation, demonstrating, showing me in class and showing your classmates that, you did the work and you learned a thing or two and you can apply and talk about and speak eloquently about what it is you learned. And I think maybe with education, just to get your thoughts on that, I think with education, do you think there might be more of an emphasis on participation more so than there is on papers, presentations, and tests, which AI can be used to really influence their grade and results and all that?
I do think we are headed to an interaction where there's there just by the very nature of things, we're going to end up having to emphasize evaluating things that are actually done in the classroom under controlled circumstances. Now, that could still, I still think exams can be important, provided that they're, conducted in the right way. For myself, I still try to have students do work outside of class, preparatory work, because I don't have enough time in class to have them do all of the work that I want them to do in class. But this next semester, one of the things I'm going to do is have them do like preparatory work for an assignment outside of class. But then the final analysis that kind of puts all of the pieces of the assignment together in a final kind of paragraph form, I'm going to have them produce that in the class. That final element, I'll have an opportunity to see that in their controlled circumstances and be able to see if they're able to put together the different materials for the class. Now, I haven't done that yet, so I'm sure there'll be some challenges with that too.
Yeah.
But I do think we are headed to a situation where increasingly it's going to be difficult to have students to evaluate the written work that students are doing outside of class because of the prevalence of it.
And I like how you brought up the idea that oftentimes we don't have enough time in class to get through everything we're supposed to. And I love to do activity-based learning, and I love to do engagements with students. The only trade-off is it takes up a lot of time. So the material and the speed at which you cover things and the amount of material, that takes up a lot of time. I did want to engage your thoughts on how you see maybe the future of education being, and maybe you touched on this a little bit already, but how do you think the future of education is going to look like with AI? Because it's already changing and we're trying to adjust. But as teachers, a lot of things that we used to assess students with and expect them to learn, like we would expect them to read the lessons before coming to class. Now they can just have AI give them like sparkle notes before coming to class, and it's like, how much are they really getting from the classroom? From what they can get in AI. And to me, I'm thinking if students are like, if AI can do what a teacher does in college, what's the point of maybe even going to college, right? Just kind of gauging people's thoughts on what the future of education with AI is. I don't know if you have any thoughts about that or anything.
I mean, I think uh, one of the things about AI is it makes all that information kind of instantly available to everyone at any moment in time.
Mhm.
I think there's a couple of things that AI doesn't do nearly as well. One of the things that it doesn't do quite as well is to connect insights that are going to be. I mean, shouldn't say AI, but I mean, AI can be prompted to do this as well,
Mm.
but to connect insights that are going to be meaningful to individuals and are going to be applicable to their experience and to their personal goals.
Mm.
And so I think one of the things about instruction is people are not going to be coming into the classroom and they're not going to be impressed simply by the fact that you have an abundance of information on the topic that you're talking about, because that is literally available to anyone at any particular moment in time. But I think in a world that's kind of overwhelmed by information, people are hungry for genuine insight
Yeah.
that are going to connect up with their experience and are going to be meaningful to them. And also, they are also hungry for people to help navigate through this information-rich environment and talk about the information that's more reliable and less reliable. One of the things that I found that students really engage with in terms of activities is the the analysis of information. They sense themselves being overwhelmed by by the amount of information that's out there, and activities that encourage them to kind of sit through that information and find the stuff that's more or less reliable is something that definitely seems applicable and useful to them.
Yeah, yeah. The funny thing is you can Google anything and get answers, but you brought up a good point. How do you know which one's correct? How can we make education and what they learn more connecting and relatable to their experiences? And I think a lot of the class activities that you're talking about gives them the opportunity to do that. And I think that's a really important part of teaching education, that we can explore more. But I think oftentimes students, when they come into your classroom, they see it as, here's the instructor that's going to give me a lot of, and how can I do this work as quick as I can,
Right.
to get a grade. What are your thoughts on how we can approach these students to make them more engaged or more interested? What can we do in those cases where we can actually ensure that those students actually get and absorb a good amount of information that they're supposed to?
Well, I think that one of the challenges is the the information that's conveyed in the classroom, even even in the classes that students are really connecting with, information is going to fade from students' memories. I mean, the specific details of the disciplines that we're discussing are going to fade from their mind. I think the things that are going to stick with the students are the skills they develop, the skills in reading, the skills in analysis, and the skills in writing. Because those things that are developed in the classroom, even once they're no longer engaging with that same material in the future, they can continue to build those skills in a way that's durable and can stick with them in their lives. So I think it's really important to recognize that the information that we're dealing with in any course is just a move to an end. The ultimate goal is to change the student themselves, to change. And that sometimes the information can change your worldview. Sometimes the insight can really shift your perspective. It can shift your values. But I think uh, the focus in the classroom has to be on activities that are high impact, that have the capacity to build student skills, to change student perspectives, and and not simply to, you know, try to download another section of information because the information itself is not in short supply. And that's obviously been the case for a long time. And even before AI, you obviously had the internet. There's a mass of information that was available, and obviously you have information that's available. A lot of information comes with it. So there's never really been an information shortage, but connecting that with student experience in a way that really changes perspective and builds skill. I think that's something that can be rare and that students recognize as valuable even today.
Yeah, no, that's a good point because I think a lot of students may not see the value in education. And it might not be because they don't care. It might be because they have the wrong idea of what education is. They probably think, oh, I'm here in class and I'm just expected to remember everything, regurgitate out a test, and move on. But I think you summed it up fairly nicely about how these are life learning skills, where you constantly have to grow, constantly critical thinking is something all human beings have to do. When you face critical moments and decisions in life, you got to learn how to navigate this information. And I think school is intended to help prepare students for all of that, with those critical thinking skills. Do you think that, and maybe we can talk a little bit about history here, when it comes to critical thinking in history, where do you think the value in learning history really comes? Do you think it just comes from looking at the wisdom of how society or people behaved or the decisions they made in the past, and we can use that to inform the present or the future? Or where do you think the value of history, learning history, really comes from? Because we all know it's important, right? But where every subject has their own unique area of importance and contribution to academia, where do you think that comes from with history?
Yeah, I think there are a variety of things that are important for history. I think talking about like the past and the present and the future, I do think there's a value to learning history in terms of kind of acting wisely in the world, knowing what sorts of events have led to other events in the past can give you an idea about what's likely to occur if you take different actions in the present and the future, and can help give you just sort of a additional level of insight and wisdom in your decision making. I do think that another crucial value of history is in understanding the perspectives of others. I think at its best, I think history allows us to see it allows us to see the past, but it allows us to see that the past looks different depending on your perspective. And I think that can be really valuable just in terms of cultivating a little bit of humility among people and understanding that our own perspective isn't the only perspective that exists. And also kind of imaginatively putting ourselves in the shoes of other people and understanding why they might have acted or why they might have made the particular decisions that they did, what their particular values were. I think that can help us to to adopt our own position with a certain sense of humility and also a greater sense of wisdom as well.
Do you think the role playing activity technique that you employ in your classroom does a pretty good job at that?
I think it does. I think it does some things very well. I think it does an excellent job of focusing on the skills that you want students to develop, whether that's skills in written communication, oral communication, interaction with others. I think it's very good in that way.
Hmm.
I think one of the things that students are really hungry for in the classroom is the social dimension. I think they really desire to interact with other people in a genuine way
Yeah.
and to build some of those group skills and those interaction skills. And I think that role playing can be an excellent way of doing that.
Yeah. I mean, it seems like a big part of learning is that social component. It's not just sitting back and listening to whatever is in the lecture. A big part of it is the opportunity to really share your thoughts, take a different perspective, and learn from your classmates and colleagues. So I think that's a really good idea to have students to be focused on that social component because I think that's where so much of the learning comes from, and not just from top down from like the teacher to the students. So I think role playing is a really good way to engage and open up, particularly people who might be a little more shy or introverted. Might make them more comfortable with in the lines of techniques and teaching methods. Do you think you said students are hungry for that social aspect? Do you think there might be something to students being less social nowadays? Could it be the rise of technology that's creating that social barrier? And I'm not sure what that is. I'm not sure if it's technology, a shift in culture where students are indoors playing games rather than running around outside with their friends. How do you see that as being a major obstacle in teaching and education nowadays?
Yeah, I think there's definitely a variety of students. I do occasionally have some students who will have trouble connecting. Maybe when they're assigned to work in groups, maybe a little bit standoffish and not terribly interactive with students. I guess I try to be a little bit understanding of that. Not to say that, anything goes. I mean,
Right.
one of the things that I try to do is to remove some of the technological distractions. So I understand that different students will have different levels of excitement about interaction. But by insisting that, phones be put away during discussion, something like that, it kind of prevents students who they're for whom the natural reaction is just to go back to their phones and things like that. It kind of removes that temptation to sort of open up a little bit of space for them to maybe experience a little bit of some of that person to person connection, even if it is a little bit uncomfortable for them at the beginning.
No, that's a good point. I've noticed some instructors that I've talked to, they have students use their phone to like texting, and they'll have like an anonymous board where students can message each other anonymously and stuff. And I'm like, that seems like a great idea too, but I'm kind of on the fence. So, is that just making them more comfortable communicating, with technology rather than in person? You know what I mean? And there are some benefits I could see with technology too, because oftentimes some students, when they communicate with technology, they tend to have to think and reflect a little bit more on what they're going to say to type it out. Uh, Sometimes if they read what they type and send it, if they proofread before they send their messages, that can be very beneficial too. But then they lose that social component in which there's a whole nother skill set of learning and talking with someone in person that you can develop that you just can't with technology. So I find that to be kind of interesting too. I like to incorporate a bit of both, so sometimes removing the technology can be very useful. What are your thoughts on that?
I'm definitely in the same boat as you. I don't think it's an either or situation. And there's definitely some situations I find where, in some cases, interacting through technology can be a lower bar for some students than actually speaking out individually. So, for example, when we're in a government class and we're talking about a particular political issue, oftentimes I'll have students start thinking about an issue by responding anonymously using technology to kind of put their thoughts into place. And then I'll encourage students to build on that to speak out and kind of put into words their thoughts. And now not everybody is going to take that step from the technological communication to the in-person communication, but it kind of gives a certain amount of preparation, allows people to formulate their thoughts on that, uh, as opposed to just like springing questions on students and then expecting them to kind of automatically respond without giving a lot of scaffolding.
Yeah, no, that's a good way to put it. In relation to like student behavior and expectations, do you think, given the rise of AI, do you think AI has changed what students expect from a professor? Or do you think they still go into class thinking this is someone who's supposed to tell me everything that I can learn from AI or something? Do you think students see professors in their role differently, given that, AI can do a lot of what they probably expect teachers to do?
That's a good question. And I guess it's probably something that I have a little bit more to learn in terms of it's not necessarily a question that I've directly asked students myself. Obviously, right now, the students that are coming to class, we're dealing with students who, if we're talking about the freshman class, we're dealing with students who basically had AI around throughout their high school years. And I think it's even now in the process of changing expectations even more. I think that's probably a question that I'm still in process of. I still find that even though information is so widely available, students are open to compelling interpretations and insights, something that'll allow them to sift through the massive amount of information and find the few insights that are most compelling or important. I still think they value that possibility and that prospect, simply because the amount of information out there is simply so overwhelming that if you don't have any sort of guide through it, it can be a little bit confusing and overwhelming. And I think students still do value the having somebody who has some expertise in an area and to provide a little bit of guidance about how to navigate through that territory. But I think, as AI maybe becomes more effective in doing that task as well, it might raise further questions for us.
Yeah. And that's one of the hard things about being a teacher is, and I would say about almost any profession, because I think being a teacher is probably one of the hardest jobs that technology can replace. And I think the more we see technology like AI, I'm not saying replacing teachers, but doing more duties and responsibilities that a teacher can do. I see this as AI or technology being able to do a lot of other things that a lot of other jobs can do, because jobs that require human interaction, human connection, and sharing information and all this stuff. These are jobs difficult for a machine to do, but they're actually getting better. Nowadays you can call up places and you're talking to a robot or AI, and it sounds like a personal assistant directing your call. And it's like, oh wow, that's pretty impressive, And this is just first generation AI. Maybe in another 4 or 5 years, second generation AI might be able to come up with class activities on the spot for students and give them directions, break up into groups, and all this stuff. Which leads me to my next question about the future role of an educator. Do you think jobs as teachers will be less valued given the rise of AI, or do you think maybe we can still be equally as valuable, but we just have to adjust our responsibilities and roles as future educators?
I do think there's definitely going to have to be some adjustments. I think it's a little bit hard right now.
Yeah.
The world is in such a state of flux with this technology. I think people are trying to figure out what the future holds and kind of trying to predict that and understanding what people will need, what skills people will need to operate in the world in the future world can be a little bit challenging at this point.
Yeah.
I don't think teachers are going to go away, but I do think that AI is going to become increasingly omnipresent. And I mean, right now we have this distinction between students and AI in the classroom. I think you can see the commercials right now about like the AI glasses that are becoming available, and people talking about like like implants and people's heads and things like that. Obviously, that's still a little ways in the future, but there may well be a future where the distinction between where human thought begins and where AI begins becomes increasingly difficult to separate. And it's
Yeah.
a little bit frightening for me because even as the quality of assignments increases as students use AI to complete it, there's also kind of a certain homogenization of thought, and everything starts to sound a little bit the same, and people come to very
Yeah.
similar conclusions
Yeah.
about all the issues, and people lose a certain element of their distinctive perspective.
Yeah. No, that's a good point. I'm glad you brought that up because one thing about education is it's supposed to increase our individual thinking, our individual critical thinking. And if the tools we're using, we're all using in a similar way, I can structure our brain to think in similar ways, we do lose a bit of that intellectual diversity. And that can be very scary. Do you think as teachers, maybe we just have to be more creative in the classroom, be more creative with how we can not get around AI because they're going to use it no matter what, but how we can use AI to be a productive tool in the classroom. And I think for a lot of teachers, trying to find that creativity, that balance of academic rigor, technology, and creativity, I think that's a big struggle that I'm sure a lot of other teachers have too. How can we be creative in letting students use AI and everything in the classroom? Have you come up with any ways that students can use AI in the classroom or thinking about any ways students can possibly use AI productively in the classroom?
Well, one of the things that I try to do, like I said, I think that one of the challenges that students have is sorting through information and figuring out what information is more or less valuable.
Hmm.
And so one of the things that I'll frequently have students do, let's take a government class, for example, when we're talking about a particular policy issue. One thing that I'll oftentimes do is have students use AI to brainstorm different arguments on a particular topic, but then I try to add an extra layer in there where students are engaging with their own critical thinking skills to assess how convincing they find the arguments that are being presented to them by AI.
That's good.
So it's not just a question of kind of just giving back the information that AI has given them, but trying to assess how convincing they find that information to be. And much in the same way that they would have to do if they, ask a particular question of AI on their own, they'd have to sift through the results and try to figure out what they thought was convincing and valuable from what they were getting from the AI.
Yeah. No, that's actually a good idea. I'm gonna have to use that myself. I like that idea. So there's one question I wanted to ask you about anxiety in higher education about AI. Do you think the current anxiety in higher education about AI is proportionate to the actual threat, or are we just overreacting or underreacting with the whole AI thing? What are your thoughts?
I don't think we're overreacting. I think that the questions that are raised by AI have actually been with us for a while, and and I think educators have been dealing with some of these questions for a long time. Whether the education is about the information and it's about the skills that are being developed, but I think in some ways the AI transformation just poses these questions in such an immediate way that perhaps some of us have been a little bit hesitant to address these questions and have been kind of operating on a model of education where the information is the scarce commodity.
All right.
Well, we're just kind of in a situation where that's so obviously not the case anymore that it's really forcing a transformation. I don't think we're underestimating the challenge. I think it's a challenge that's probably even more dramatic than the development of the internet or something like that in terms of its capacity to change education.
I totally agree. I think you put it perfectly where we're not overreacting. The internet has brought us to a place where we considered all these things, but AI kind of forced us to make that transition. I think that's a good way of putting it. Just to ask you, what do you think a healthy relationship between a a college classroom 10 years from now where AI might be a bit more advanced. What do you think that would look like?
Yeah, that's really it's really a little bit hard for me to predict.
Right, yeah.
Kind of, the environment's changing so fast.
hmm I really don't know what's going to happen myself, but I think education will eventually come down to students who really want to learn will take the route of going to college. And I think students who just want to, if there are still jobs in the future, because AI can do so much, because a good portion of reason, a big reason why people go to school and get a degree is to get a job. I think that would be like a different route. I think eventually education might just come down to if you really want to learn, really want to know about certain things, if you really value education for what it is, college will do that. I don't necessarily think I see college being some big institution like they are today. Kind of like how malls used to be back in like the 70s, 80s, 90s, and 2000s. Now we see malls closing down everywhere. And I don't want to be pessimistic, but I almost see college campuses being like that down the road. Maybe not 10 years down the road, but somewhere down the road, I think college campuses will become a lot smaller, and they'll just be focused on purely students who want to go simply to get an education, even though we might have Neuralink in our brain and everything. But that's just kind of my thought. I know these are just projections, but that's kind of where I see education going. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's you may well be right. For me, that's a little bit of a sad prospect
Yeah.
for somebody who's somebody who learning is such a important part of their life.
Right.
I do think getting at the portion of our mind that's not kind of integrated with the AI system is going to be something that's going to be increasingly valuable
Yeah.
and increasingly perhaps difficult.
Yeah.
But I still think it's worth the effort to try to do that, and to try to build some of those thinking skills independent of the AI, especially with people talking about just the threat that AI poses to human intelligence
Yeah.
if it kind of takes over all the different activities that we used to associate with independent critical thinking.
Yeah. It's interesting to see how AI is changing everything. I tend to be, well, I should say I try to be optimistic. Someone in education, we like doing what we do. We like educating and being there in the classroom with students. But I think technology, it's going to change things in a way that is going to change us fairly drastically in terms of our job, our responsibilities. So that's always interesting. But we'll see how things go.
Yeah, I certainly agree. For one constant is change, and
Yeah.
I think over the course of the next decade, things are probably going to undergo some pretty revolutionary change. It's probably difficult to predict right this particular moment, but the thing that we can predict is that change is coming.
Yeah. I mean, especially someone in history, I'm sure
Yeah.
you have an abundance of knowledge more than most people about how civilization changed due to like technology or whatever. But I do want to ask you before I hit our closing questions, what do you think maybe 100 years from now, people studying history about life in the 2020s, what are some major historical things do you think they'll be studying in their history classes about our current time?
Well, I do think that one of the things that I think this particular period of time is going to be viewed as a really important moment in terms of the history of democracy. I think we have a lot of debate going on not just with artificial intelligence, but just across the globe in terms of the amount of voice that normal everyday people have in their government. And I think that one of the reasons for the prosperity that we experienced in the modern world is the fact that we have institutions that really take into account the voice of common people. I think that's one of the real foundations of our current prosperity. And I think one of the things that we'll be looking at over the course of the next 100 years is what the future looks like in terms of the ability of everyday people to express their voices and have their voices heard in the government. I think, without getting very political, I think that there's different kinds of forces that are at work in the world, kind of pushing us more or less in the direction of democratic institutions. And I think that's something that's going to be hugely important in the future. I think we're kind of at an inflection point.
Do you think that there is a point throughout history where we'll stop learning about things before this period and we'll pick up from one particular point in time and start history from there? Or do you think maybe all of history, as far back as we have things documented, all of that will still be learned, hundreds of years down the road? We might cover it a little bit, but we're not going to focus on like the ancient Greeks or the American independence or anything like that. There might be a point in time in history where this is more modern history. Here's where everything's more important, and we should start from here and just carry on forward with this information.
Well, one of the things that's been interesting for me, and when I've been talking with students about the learning activities that they find compelling, is that a lot of students are hungry for the big picture. It's not necessarily that they want to learn every detail about ancient Greek society, but a lot of students are hungry for the perspective that scholarship can offer about the deep history of where they come from, the origins of the universe, the kind of development of life over time, the big picture and the development of civilizations. And I don't think that those things are going to go away. I don't think that, I think as human beings, we have a desire to understand how we got to where we are now.
Right.
And I think that understanding the origins of things is part of that. Now, there may come a time when people are less interested in the details of some of those early historical epics. I definitely sometimes deal with that, but I think people will still be hungry for the big picture, and the extent to which you can connect up some of those specifics from particular historical moments to the questions that people are asking about their own lives and their own existences. I think that future will continue to be relevant. I don't think we're going to start saying that you only need to study history with the invention of the printing press, or the invention of computers, or the invention of the internet, or the invention of AI. I think that those earlier periods will continue to be relevant, but I think it'll be especially important to pitch that information in a way where people can see the relevance to the questions and issues that are important to them as individuals.
Wow. Oh, that's been wonderful. I feel like there's so much more we can dive into, but I do want to ask, what do you want our audience to know about your passion, why it's important to be aware of either teaching history or teaching techniques? Why is it important to be aware of these things?
I guess just thinking from the perspective of teachers, I think that the issue of student engagement is kind of, I mentioned this at the beginning, but I think it's really an existential question for teachers today. If our students aren't engaged with us in the classroom, then there's going to be real questions about the value of what we're doing if you can't promote that student engagement. And so, not to be overly pessimistic, but I think for teachers, it's a matter of self-preservation. To figure out how to successfully engage students in the classroom is a way of helping make an argument for our profession in the future. But I also think that engagement and insight is also an argument for kind of what makes us human and what distinguishes us and what makes our human perspective so valuable is that ability to pick out information and to convincingly articulate a particular perspective. And so I think that as we consider the future for what makes humans valuable versus what an AI can do, I think that that's an extremely important thing, not just for preserving jobs of teachers, but for preserving the perspective and the contributions of human beings in society as well. And so for me, it's a passion, but it's also a necessity, I think, as well.
Oh, it's beautiful. And you put it so clearly and eloquently. It's just poetic in a way. It's beautiful. So a couple more questions. What advice, because my channel is all about helping people discover and find their passion, and we can clearly see that your passion, history and teaching, and you're certainly great at doing all those things. What advice would you give listeners to help them discover their passion as you discovered yours?
Well, I think, I mean, one of the things to do is to learn from, people who are engaged in the same pursuit. There's no shortage of people out there who are actively thinking about teaching in the age of AI, who are trying to figure out how to engage students and how to promote their learning. And I think it's really just a matter of finding some of those communities and and listening to the insights of people who are engaged in that practice. And also just kind of recognizing that you don't have to reinvent the wheel. There are people who are engaged in coming up with techniques to try to engage students, and a lot of those materials are available. Obviously, some free, some not. But there are resources that are available out there to help equip you to engage with students and to kind of cultivate kind of high impact learning if you're willing to kind of explore and open yourself up and try new things that maybe you haven't tried before.
No, that's a good way of putting it. I always say one of the best ways people can discover what they're passionate about is to look and speak to people who are passionate, because oftentimes people inspire and ignite that passion in others. And I think people tend to do that the best when it comes to finding inspiration, finding what they're passionate about. You have people who say, oh, I love music because my dad was a musician, blah, blah, blah. They're saying, oh, I love studying mathematics or physics because my math professor was so passionate about it. They made me see math beyond numbers and equations. So that's one reason why I do this channel. And speaking to people like you, where you can explain and articulate your thoughts so clearly about history and teaching, all that stuff, that's just really important. I can inspire a lot of people as well. So thank you for doing that. Thank you for being here.
Oh, no, but my pleasure. I really enjoyed our conversation. So
Cool.
thank you very much.
Last question, did you have fun?
I did have I had a ball, so it was really fun talking with you and thinking about some of these issues. And I feel like having the opportunity to chat with you about this helps me to see things a little bit more clearly myself. So I appreciate that.
Well, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed that interview, please click like, share, and subscribe to support my content. If you have any questions for our guest, please leave them in the comments section or message me on Instagram for a response video and a special shout out to you. Until next time, I'm your host, Rocky Lowe, saying, learn with purpose and live with passion. Stay rational, folks.